I'm the medical director for our biggest nutraceuticals company. Also got an attachment to one of the universities there. And before working here, I worked for our equivalent of the FDA for about 4 or 5 years. So if there's any questions about the Australian system and how we regulate these things, I'm happy to try to answer those as well. But really my talk's quite broad. I'm sort of a public health physician, so I've got a real interest in how to make change at the population level. So it's about as far as you can get from cell cultures. So it really just starts off with a little bit of a talk about the significance of the problem and trends of obesity, and then goes into some reasons for that, ways we may approach it, and particularly whether there's a role for nutraceuticals. All right, so non-communicable disease, which includes things like heart disease and cancer and such, it's now the leading cause of mortality worldwide, and it's also a really major source of morbidity and economic costs. So that little figure just shows, 60-odd% of deaths worldwide are attributable to these diseases, which are preventable in many cases. And if you really look at the risk factors, you can cluster them into 2 main groups. One of them is a group of sort of behavioural features, and the other one are a group of biological factors. And you can see from the table there that the behavioural ones are lifestyle choices largely, and the biological ones are all similar in a couple of ways, one of them being the fact that they're all properties of the body which are like continuous variables where there's a normal range, and being outside the normal range increases your risk of disease, and obesity is amongst them. All right, and now this slide just breaks that down a little bit more and shows the contribution from a lot of those risk factors in terms of deaths worldwide and morbidity worldwide. And the numbers are not really that important, except to say that they're large numbers. And obesity is sitting in the middle there. But when you consider that these things often happen together, the mortality and the morbidity associated with these factors is huge. So it's something we really need to work out a way to address. And when you look at the overall economic costs associated with them, it gets even worse. And you'll see that smoking and obesity are 2 of the top 3. So this is from a report that was released in November last year called the McKinsey report, and it talks about ways to tackle obesity, and it's a really good read. But you see the top 3 there, they're all over 2% of... Oh, my turn to do that. They're all over 2% of GDP worldwide, so that's a huge amount of money, absolutely huge. And as you see right across on the side there, the red arrows going up, they're all increasing as well. All right, so economic costs, just put this up to really remind ourselves that economic costs are not just treating a disorder, hospital costs, things like that. They're the direct costs. But there's also a lot of other costs which are more indirect, and then they come from missing work, reduced lifespan, social costs and things like that add together to further the costs and have implications further down the track. All right, so when we talk about obesity, we define it by BMI, and so for those of you who don't know, BMI is your weight divided by your height squared. And even though we use it as a measure, it's not a perfect measure. In some cases, it's not a good measure of obesity. For example, in children or in people who have high muscle mass, they may weigh more and it may not be attributable to fat. But it's about as good a measure as we've got at the moment. And basically, there's cut-off points so that between 25 to 30 means overweight and above 30 means obese. And that changes a little bit between cultures, but we don't really need to worry about that. The important thing is that the prevalence of obesity is increasing. And these are Australian figures. And you can see from this figure that, if I can get this right, there's an increase both in terms of successive birth cohorts. So for younger people at a given age, their BMI tends to be higher. But there's also an increase over time within a birth cohort. So as you get older, your BMI goes up as well. So this is true for males and females, and it's true in lots of other countries, not just Australia. And the next figure just sort of highlights that, which shows increasing rates in a number of countries. So you can sort of see that there. And on the next slide, I really just want to go into one level of extra complexity. Again, this is from the McKinsey report. And I think this is a fantastic picture. And what it shows down the bottom is basically the obesity prevalence back in the year 2000. And on the y-axis there, it shows how much that prevalence increased between the year 2000 to 2008. So what you can sort of see, and those dots are coloured for a reason. They're by region. So the bluey coloured ones are from Oceania and Australia. The sort of orange ones are Africa, the yellow ones South America, and so on. And what you can see from this is that up there in the sort of top right corner as you look at it, the countries from Oceania feature up there, and they're countries that started off with a high prevalence of obesity and ones that have increased relatively more over the 8 years from 2000. And then if you look right back down in the other corner, you see clusters of African and Asian countries which started off at a low prevalence rate of obesity and have increased a relatively small amount. And then in the middle, we've got lots of countries from Europe, North America, and just above them, lots of South American countries. So they're places that started off with a sort of moderate prevalence of obesity and increased either moderately or a little bit more than that. And so I think this is really a useful slide to point out that, you know, the increasing prevalence of obesity is a worldwide thing, but it's not equivalent around the world. And what you can tell from this is that there are regional variations, whether they're cultural factors, environmental factors, or biological factors. You know, something's going on that different parts of the world are behaving a little bit differently. All right, so 2015 is significant for a couple of reasons. The question is, does anybody recognise this? For those of you who do, good. For those of you who do not, this is from Back to the Future, which is some films that were released back in the 1980s and early 90s. And it was basically some films about a guy who went back in time 30 years and went forward in time 30 years. So he started off in 1985 and he came to 2015. It was just a good opportunity to bring this up. So another thing happened in 1985, and basically it was that the CDC started releasing prevalence maps of the United States, and it basically shows the prevalence of obesity in the different states. And you can see there that for lots of states in 1985 they actually didn't have data on, and the ones they did have data for tended to have prevalence rates of around 10 to 15% or below. Now the interesting thing is that if you put Marty McFly from Back to the Future in his little DeLorean there and you fly him forward 30 years, you can actually see what was happening in the US that he didn't really notice. And I'll just flick through these slides really quickly, but just keep an eye on the United States and see what happens to the colours. Unfortunately, the 2014 map's not available till November, they tell me, so I had to stop at 2013. But it's a pretty drastic change. And so some of the things that Marty McFly found in 2015 were flying cars, which are not really in common practice. Self-drying jackets, also not really in common practice. Hoverboards, not really. And thin kids on hoverboards are also not that common anymore. So few visions not realised. So why is it an issue? Well, there's a number of reasons I think that it's an issue, and one of them is that it's multifactorial and complex, and we'll talk about it in the next slide. But there's also a number of other factors which, you know, are about the condition itself and also about the environment that make it incredibly difficult to tackle and can help to explain why it's become such an issue. So, you know, obesity is something that is common. We look at it, people don't seem sick, so we don't think about it as a serious condition. We can't see what's happening inside the body. The outcomes tend to be a long way down the track and things that we don't have to pay for now, or if we do have to pay for them, they're kind of indirect costs that are subsidised by different things. And I guess the other factors down here are that it requires constant thinking these days to actually be active and be healthy, because it's almost always the hardest choice. I mean, you don't have to get up to turn on the TV anymore. You don't really even need to get up to answer the phone anymore. You don't even need to turn the pages of a book anymore. You know, being active is getting really difficult. And if you don't think about it all the time, you really, you know, you take a path that leads towards gaining weight. So it's complex. So this was a picture done by the UK government. And it's fantastic. And the only thing I really wanted to point out is that just about everything you can possibly think of is connected to this map. But at the end of the day, there's a few points here, like the points of a compass. And they're about diet, they're about activity, they're about psychological factors, and they're about biology. And lots of these things that are around the side here are about environmental factors and such that impact upon those, so environment and cultural things. So anything that's going to tackle obesity in a significant way is going to have to affect lots of these things. All right, so how do we tackle it? Well, from a public health perspective, when we talk about continuous variables like blood pressure and obesity and things like that, we tend to think of them as being normally distributed. As I said, a normal range in the middle with areas to the side that increase risk of disease. And there's two main ways that we talk about approaching them. One is that you can look for the people who are in the risk zone and try and treat them reasonably aggressively to bring them back into the normal range. Or another way is that you can move shift the whole curve down so that more people come into the normal range. And they have pros and cons. The individual strategies, although they tend to cost more, tend to have more meaning to individuals and can cause more of an effect in them. But the population approaches can be a lot more cost effective on a population level. And although individuals may not always see the benefit, when you look at the costs across the population to the healthcare system, they tend to be more. So for obesity, the curve actually isn't normal anymore. There's more people in the sort of overweight zone. So given there are more people in the risk zone, individual strategies can be useful. So both approaches can be useful. But as I kind of mentioned, the individual approaches tend to be more expensive. So can we afford that? All right, now again, this one's from the McKinsey report as well, and it shows the effects of some approaches to losing weight. And all I really wanted to point out from this is that if you look at the ones that have the highest impact across the population, things like portion control, reformulation of foods, high calorie, availability of high calorie foods, these are things that do occur across the population, but probably even more importantly, they're things that the user really doesn't have to actively do anything about. The choices are made for them. Little effort, little choice, they seem to work because it's too hard, and suddenly being healthy actually becomes an easier option. All right, and now this just sort of builds upon that last picture and talks about the amount of weight loss for certain types of interventions and the costs. And again, the only thing I really want to point out is that you've got some things up here that can cause quite a degree of weight loss, but they're expensive. And then you've got a cluster of things down here that can cause perhaps little bits of weight loss, but they're variably costly, both in terms of monetary value, but also time, effort, and that kind of a thing. So I'm not the only person that's noticed that. Other authors have as well. And a treatment gap has kind of been described that sits between them, with people saying, well, it's fine that you've got something that can cause a huge degree of weight loss, but you can only really do that in morbidly obese people. And then you've got all these other things that cause little degrees of weight loss, but they're not really enough to be meaningful. So what we need are some interventions that fill the gap. And I guess this is where I'm not sure that we do, because I think that if you add together a number of treatments or interventions that cause small degrees of weight loss, you can build that up into something significant. And certainly when you look at that map that showed how everything is connected, unless you start making change at a lot of points, you're not really going to make a sustained change to weight loss. And again, in the McKinsey report, they found exactly the same thing. Don't worry about the numbers. This just shows the more interventions you make in somebody's life, the more likely you are to make a health impact. And you'll see that you really only start getting significant impacts when you've started to change about 8 or 10 things. So one-off changes, one-off pills, one-off anything don't seem to work very well. So where do nutraceuticals and herbals fit in? Well, the big question to me is, can they help fill that treatment gap? We've got a number of different candidates, lots of different ingredients with different components. We've got lots of possible mechanisms of action that they can work by, and we'll talk a little bit about these things in the next couple of slides. But I think it's important to look actually beyond that. So it's not just about what's in the product, but it's about whether the product can actually influence other parts of people's lives as well. So, and a lot of this has to do with labelling and sort of promotion and education campaigns and things like that. In Australia, for all weight loss products, people need to put disclaimers on there that say this should be taken with, dietary change and exercise programs. You can control behaviour to some degree by a dosing regime. If people can't take it within so many hours of a meal, then they can't eat. Other labelling messages, support and education, working together with other parts of industry or the public and private sector to work things so that it can be a combined effort. And the other advantages I think that they have is that they're relatively low cost and they're relatively easily accessible because, you can buy them in supermarkets or pharmacies or wherever it happens to be. So these factors taken together, I think, mean that there's likely to be a quite important place for them, but it's not going to be a magic bullet type effect that you can give somebody a pill and ignore the rest of the world. All right, so next couple of slides just show you a little bit about the Australian landscape for medicines for weight loss. And I should just very quickly explain that word listed. So in Australia, we have a sort of two-tiered regulatory approach. We have listed medicines and registered medicines. Listed medicines are the low-risk ones, which include most nutraceuticals. Registered ones tend to be sort of more formal over-the-counter medicines and prescription medicines. And the pathway in for listed medicines is a lot easier than for registered medicines. So for these things, people can actually fill it out on a computer at home and they certify that it's manufactured in the right way, that I've got evidence to support the claims. They click a button and they get a certificate. And then being caught depends on post-market regulatory action. So these are the medicines that people tend to market for weight loss, and these are the ones that often make the false claims and get the publicity and all that sort of a thing. And if you look at the types of claims people are making, well, you'll see that there's about 300 products on the Australian market, and the claims fit into a few different clusters. There's some around appetite suppression and satiety, there's some around body composition, some around metabolism, thermogenesis, and then there's sort of some very broad ones about weight control and weight management. And if you go a step further and you actually look at what's in those products, next slide's a little bit busy. These were the top ranking ingredients in Australian products for weight loss and weight loss related type claims. And those clusters that I mentioned before are the colour coding, and this is the number of products having these ingredients in them. So green tea is right up the top there, and you probably can't read that, but it's a mix of things from certain ingredients you would expect to be in weight loss products and certain ingredients you wouldn't expect to be in weight loss products. And the ones that you wouldn't expect to be there could be really for two reasons in the Australian market. One, because people are just, making claims that aren't necessarily true. Or two, the product may have been for something else as well as weight loss, and that could be there for that sort of a thing. So, strong bones and weight loss or whatever it happened to be. But I think the interesting thing is here, is you look at the breakdown of the types of claims in all these ingredients, pretty much all of them have a bit of a mix of these things. And you would think that if we actually knew what the ingredients are doing, there'd be a lot more of a sort of consistent approach with certain ingredients being pretty much all one colour or not. So that's really there just to give you that sort of a picture. And so what's the problem with evidence for nutraceuticals in weight loss? Well, when I was working for our TGA, which is like the US FDA, you know, we used to have to look at these products a lot because they're the ones that attract attention. And certainly there are a number of ingredients that have been tried in various ways for weight loss, and for quite a lot of them they show small degrees of weight loss. There's often contention about whether it's clinically significant or not. Another issue is that the trial length tends to be a bit too short for weight loss medicines. And there's lots of these ingredients that kind of just left half undone, with people not kind of wanting to go to the next steps. And when you do have something that works quite well, the side effects become an issue and it's suddenly not readily available to everybody anymore. So the last couple down there show combinations, and you know, there's a little bit more promise of a bit, you know, high degree of weight loss. But again, short trials, one-off trials, haven't been repeated. You know, what's the population like? Is it applicable to the general population you live in? Lots of things we need to look at, but promise is there. Okay, and this just highlights some of the things I sort of mentioned before. We've got some data for lots of ingredients, but we don't really have good data for any ingredients. The ones we do, again, the degree of weight loss is probably not significant enough for people to get excited about. Often it's difficult to isolate ingredients if you've got multi-ingredient combinations, or if you're looking at a single ingredient, which components are doing the trick, and that makes it hard if you want to standardise products, extracts and things like that. Population relevance is something in Australia that we take quite seriously, and we often find that the populations that are involved in weight loss trials tend not to be representative of the Australian population. So, you know, some that come to mind are lots of ones done in more homogeneous populations in India and other parts of Asia. And because there's so many, you know, besides the biological factors, so many social and cultural factors that can impact on weight loss, we don't just accept these kinds of trials. Again, methodology and confounders and duration. Like I said, there's not many trials over 3 months in duration for weight loss. And what you usually find with trials for weight loss is that up to about 6 months you lose weight, and then you start putting it back on, and then you start to plateau. So certainly for prescription medicines, you need trials that are at least a year long. And I think for any trials, you need trials that are at least 6 to 12 months. And again, the methodology is variable. Sometimes there are good trials, sometimes there are not. And then the other issue here, I guess, around sort of real life use of products, well, everybody expects a magic bullet. You market something for weight loss and it gives you 1 kilo, or what's this, 2 pounds? 2 pounds or 1 kilogram loss over 6 months. Nobody gets excited about it at all. But you take it for 3 years, you lost a little bit more weight. You do it with diet and exercise, you lost a little bit more weight over that, and so on. Quality and adulteration, we've had that spoken about a little bit today. In Australia, that's not a huge issue. We actually find it more in products that have been imported into the country, either for personal use or illegally. Because the one thing we do have a lot of control over in Australia is the manufacturing part, and there's a constant surveillance by the Therapeutic Goods Administration over countries' manufacture and of product sampling and stuff like that. And then, of course, there's the real-world use. I mean, people in the real world aren't in clinical trials. They take things sometimes, they take things in the wrong way, they mix things together, all kinds of things happen. So even if you do find that something works, will it work in the real world? We don't always know. All right, so I think this is my last slide, and it's just sort of trying to tie everything together. The first point is actually a quote from that report, which I think applies across the board. Success in treating obesity requires as many interventions as possible and a full range of sectors to be involved. So our sector may be one of those, and I think it will be one of those, but we can't neglect the other parts. And each part has to pretty much, acknowledge each other and respect each other, because only by tackling lots of parts of that puzzle are we going to actually make enough change around a person to have an impact on their weight. There's no safe magic weight loss pill. I mean, how many times I say that, it doesn't seem to stick. I think that's also important. It's easier to put weight on than to lose it, again, because most choices tend towards the sort of putting on weight side of things these days. And so because of that, losing weight does require commitment, and it requires behaviour change, and importantly it requires change. So if there's a nutraceutical that works, it's not going to work in a week. If it does work in a week, then that's probably a worry. What you want is something that actually works over time. And I mean, for the industry, that's kind of good too, because it means somebody's got to take it for a long period of time. You just got to convince them that they're worth it, that it's worth it. But those things, I think, really have to be hammered home. And, you know, if somebody asks me to help them with weight loss, the first thing I tell them is, just promise me you won't weigh yourself in the first month. Because what invariably happens is they weigh themselves, either they've got no change in weight or they've lost a tiny little amount and they give up. So you can't make false promises. I think that's a road to failure. Again, multiple weight loss strategies into a daily routine, because the easier it is for people to do these things, the more likely they are to keep doing them. Nutraceuticals may be able to fill a treatment gap. We've got lots of opportunities out there, but we need good research to actually look at them and work out how to put them together to make as good an effect as possible. And like I said, you can't ignore the other parts of the world. And with our products, we need to think more beyond the ingredients and through the advertising, and how we can actually make these kinds of changes in people's lives. And I think that at the moment is something we really don't do that well, but there are lots of opportunities out there, more and more, particularly with things like apps and mobile phones and things like that, where you could, in theory, you know, coordinate use of nutraceuticals with exercise routines or diets and all that kind of a thing. So I think that's about it for me. They're the references. Any questions? Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? I've got one, mainly because it's an area that I've been following, and that is that you classified, I think it was at the beginning, you were talking about non-communicable diseases. And so I assume that you're classifying obesity as a non-communicable disease. And there is actually quite a deal of evidence that's coming through both in animal literature as well as human literature that in fact that may not be accurate, that in fact obesity should be classified as an infectious disease.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments on that?
Well, you may have noticed that I was particularly cunning there, because I actually describe it as a risk factor for non-communicable disease, rather than classifying it in its own right. I have to admit that I haven't looked in too much detail at the sort of infectious theories and things like that, but I'm aware of them. And it's certainly, you know, something we need to be aware of, because regardless of what, you know, what's causing a sort of cultural clusters and you know, common effects on body weight in certain areas, whether it's infective or cultural or social or biological, those sorts of things, we need to get on top of it and work out ways to stop the spread.
And the other, I like the sort of combination between both the Australian and the US data. The CDC chart is always impressive, and I've enjoyed using them in the past. There's another metric done by, I believe, the USDA. Okay. So that's looked at serving sizes, and the reason for that is the current administration changed that sort of food pyramid, which didn't seem to make much sense to everybody, to what was called My Plate. So it's actually myplate.gov. They split up a plate in terms of different elements of food, whether it be, you know, protein and carbohydrate and other elements. But what they did was they documented, and I think the starting point may have been from the 1950s, but I'm a little fuzzy, on serving sizes here in the US. And those of you who are not from the US and you're actually running around at restaurants and things like that, you'll notice that our serving sizes here are outrageous. And so they've actually documented either drinks, food, and the average increase since the 50s is 600%
Really?
for a serving size. And so what happens now with society is if you actually gave them what they need calorically, they would think that you're being mean, abusive, and they would never go back to your eating establishment again. And so the availability of large amounts of fiscally inexpensive, nutritionally deficit food, though, is a contributor as it relates to serving size.
Yeah, and I mean, another sort of side to that in Australia that we're seeing, I'm not sure if it's happening here as well, is that, when I was growing up, we used to be playing in the backyard of the house all the time. But since then, lot sizes have just got smaller and smaller and smaller, and house sizes have got bigger and bigger and bigger. So most people now have a backyard that's this big, and they spend all their time playing video games rather than kicking a football or something like that. So I think there's lots of things that have incrementally changed and contributing.
Any other comments? You have a question?
I just want to add, there was a conference in Oxford, a roundtable, which I had attended and given a talk on obesity. And one of the things people related to was the access to food, and related it to obesity. And this was a study, I think, done in the US, I don't know for the reference, but they talked about how less we have to walk or go to get food, and now we can even go and drive the car right to the booth, get our food. So, and there was a relationship on that showing how obesity directly relates to how far you go.
Yes, I don't doubt it. I actually made a joke once about an obesity treatment product. I said, I can make you a product right now that works. It actually doesn't matter what's in it. You just make it weigh, a couple of pounds so that they've got to carry it. You can't sell it in a shop that's less than, 5, I'm just trying to think in American terms, half a mile from a car park, so they've got to walk this far to pick it up. You change the dosing instructions so they can't eat it within so many hours of a meal, so they can only have 3 meals a day. You can do all these sorts of things. And I think you're exactly right. It's just so easy now to not do anything. Yeah.
There's a study about white meat.